Lately on the channel, I've spent a lot of time talking about small bore trombones from what we know today as the King Company. Although, as we've noted, it used to be the H.N. White Company, and it absorbed a company called the Cleveland Musical Instruments Company. So lately we've talked about the King 605 and 606, we've talked about the Cleveland Superior Trombone, which was absorbed as part of H.N. White's professional line for a while, and we've mentioned in passing things like the King Tempo 1305 and King Liberty 2B. And I want to kind of bring this all together with today's video. The King Company was known to do a lot of bespoke designing and have really different parts between even two very similar models, but generally, if you take all trombones from the King, H.N. White, or Cleveland companies that took a small shank mouthpiece, you can divide them up fairly well into one of three camps. You have the extra small camp, which is bores like 481 and 491, and bells in the realm of 7 3/8 to 7.5 inches, and that includes things like the 2B Liberty, the 2BL Jigs Wiggum model, the King Cleveland 605 and King Tempo 1305, and the Cleveland Superior. And in the middle camp, you have the standard small size, which would be bores of 500 or 508, and generally bells of 8 inches. So we're talking things like the King 3B Concert or the King Tempo 306 and 606 models. There is a slight exception here in the form of the 2B Plus, which is a 500 bore but has the extra small bell, but generally I would still put it in the middle small camp. And then you have the medium camp, which I haven't talked as much about, but there you get things like the 3B Plus and 3BF Plus, the King 607, 608, 609 type models. I believe those are all 525 bores and 8-inch bells. And I drive home the point about bespoke designs specifically because a lot of the time you can take two very similar models of King trombone, which you would expect would have compatible parts, and certain parts won't be compatible. The King Company is kind of on the other end of the spectrum from something like the Bach Company, where even between vastly different trombones like the 42 and the 50, which are their 547 and 562 bore flagships, you can find things like the exact same hand slide crook, which is positively goofy if you ask me. But while certain parts won't be compatible between very similar King trombones, the nice thing is within each of those three camps that I mentioned, the extra small, the small, and the medium, you tend to be able to pair slide sections and bell sections to one another. Sometimes you can't expect to completely unsolder two models and mix and match parts, but if we're just talking about the tenon between bell and slide, you tend to be able to mix those. And I mentioned in my review of the Cleveland Superior that on a Cleveland Superior slide, you could use any of the following bells. The one it comes with, the 2B, the 605, or the 1305. And that finally gets at what we're doing in this video, which is comparing three different H.N. White and King bells on the same slide. I really find it interesting to test these different bells against one another because they should all be similar in theory. They all fit into the extra small camp, but they have subtly different responses and tonal patterns, and putting them all on the same slide is a great way to finally be able to isolate one variable at a time. So now I'm going to introduce you to three different bells and mount them all to the same slide so that we can hear some comparisons. Let's talk about today's test subjects. I have here with me my Cleveland Superior tenor trombone from 1961. I just reviewed this one on the channel and you can find the video in the top right corner in the card. So obviously in our bell comparison, the first bell, or sort of the control group, is going to be the original Cleveland Superior bell. Notable features here include Tootsie Roll counterweights, a narrow span, and a 7 3/8 inch bell flare that is the same as both of our other test subjects today, but where this bell differs is it has a much larger throat section of the bell. There's a little bit less flare right at the end, and there's a little bit more space near the flare, and this has some profound consequences on how this bell sounds. Our second contestant here is a little bit of an unusual one, but it is the King 605F bell. The standard King 605 is much more common. You'll more commonly see that without the F attachment, with a brace here, and with a counterweight here. But this is the slightly rarer F attachment counterpart. Otherwise, it's pretty unremarkable. We've got a narrow span and the same 7 3/8 inch flare with a substantially smaller bell throat and more flare saved for the end. And then our third contestant here is a little bit of an oddball. This is a fairly uncommon bell from the King 1305 Tempo model. It's similar to the 2B, the professional horn of this size, in a few ways. We've got the curved brace here as opposed to the straight up and down one, and we've got a wider span than the other two bells. Where it differs from the 2B though is obviously all this nickel plating here, which is pretty unusual. Some of the core brands like Conn and King and Holton had nickel plated trombones like this one, but they tended to be fairly uncommon. That was sort of trailblazed by the Conn Constellation 48H, which you can find reviewed up in the top right corner. Now this video is already getting to be pretty lengthy, but if you want to hear a more in-depth discussion on a custom project I'm going to be doing involving all three of these trombones that I've mentioned and the mouthpieces used in these demos, then go to patreon.com/SamuelPlaysBrass and join as a free or paid member. That's right, this extended take specifically will be available to all members, whether free or paid, so don't feel pressured to pledge any money if you don't want to. I just wanted to do an extended take on this video and talk about all the nerdy stuff, but maybe not force that out to the YouTube algorithm, which would probably kind of turn its nose up at it just because it's way too lengthy and would lose a lot of people at some point. So if you are one of the nerdiest among my audience, again, patreon.com/SamuelPlaysBrass, you can pledge as a free or paid member and gain access to the extended take of this video. Without further ado, let's get to the demos. Make sure you're wearing headphones for this part. In the week or so that has passed since I took those demos, I've messed around with each of the bells a little bit more, and I've listened to those demos a lot to try and glean the most objective observations that I can from them. And unfortunately, my variability as a player and the fact that each time I pick the horn up it's a slightly different sound and attack pattern, it doesn't do me any favors here, but hopefully if you were listening with a decent listening device, we can come away from this with similar impressions. Firstly, the thing that I really did try to drive home in my review of it is the fact that the stock Cleveland Superior bell does sound quite a lot darker than you would expect of any King sub 500 bore. Generally, King sub 500s play really bright and really tight, and that's something that I honestly do like about them, whereas the Cleveland Superior definitely has a largeness and a fatness and a darkness to the sound that is not present on either of the later King era bells. Between those two bells, those being the 605F and the 1305, it's a little bit more of a toss-up. There isn't a clear winner in any category for me between the two of them, and it's a pretty close race. But even with the added mass of the 605F's bell section, I think it may be the tightest and brightest and thinnest sound of the three, which is interesting. I do wish I had the standard 605 bell to test and not the much weightier 605F, but even then, the 605F does sound pretty harsh. Again, that's something that I do generally give to its credit. I like getting that from a sub 500 bore, but at the same time, the 1305 bell is not lacking in that department by any means. I think it has my favorite response of the three bells. The 1305 is really snappy and right on the money. It is definitely lighter than the King 605F, and that helps in that regard. But also, that's something that you can arguably get with a nickel-constructed or nickel-plated bell. Nickel is generally a metal that responds in such a way that you're getting a really sizzly, responsive tone out of it. But something I think we see highlighted here is the difference between the true student 605 and the true intermediate 1305, where both have a brightness and a punchiness to them, but with the 605 we get this really thin, focused, almost harsh cone of sound, and with the Tempo 1305, even though we have the similar brightness and punchiness, we do get a little bit more fatness. It's not nearly as much as the Cleveland Superior bell, and in fact the Cleveland Superior has more fatness to it even than the professional 2B Liberty because of the large throat, but the Tempo 1305 is kind of on an end of the continuum where it's getting all of the qualities that I like. It's getting the slight fatness and bigness to the sound while still drilling a hole in the back wall, which is the quality that I look for from a sub 500 bore trombone. So obviously my impressions are a little bit muddled, but hopefully we can agree on this much as I start to wrap this video up. From the widest to the tightest cone of sound, We start with the Cleveland Superior, obviously, which, with its large bell throat, has quite a rich and creamy darkness to the sound, especially at the soft dynamics, and I think for a sub 500 bore, sub 8-inch bell trombone, it is about as close as you can get to a symphonic trombone sound. Then in the middle, we have the Tempo 1305 bell, which has things like the wide span to kind of open up the blow a little bit. I know different people will feel differently about that, but it definitely does feel and blow in such a way that's reminiscent of the professional 2B, and it definitely has a little bit of artillery fire quality to the sound, just by virtue of the fact that it is still a sub 8-inch bell with a smaller bell throat, and it has that nickel plating, which arguably adds a little bit of punch to the sound, but I think the weight and the span of it does provide a nice fatness to the tone, whereas, again, on the thinnest, brightest, harshest end of the continuum, we have the Cleveland 605 model, and again, that is a student model designed to just blow as easily as physically possible, and that it does, especially for a student, I would say, but with things like the smaller span and the small bell throat, I think all of that combined creates a more sniper rifle-like sound. As far as brightness and darkness, it's a little bit more muddled because I think the Tempo is maybe capable of a little bit more brightness or a little bit more zing in the sound than the 605, which comparatively might be a little bit deader in some of the higher harmonics, and that just typically happens with a student model versus an intermediate or professional model. But in general, if we're just focusing on the size of the sound produced, I would say the Cleveland produces the biggest and least defined sound, the Tempo produces a very defined sound but still fairly large, and then the King Cleveland 605 produces a slightly smaller sound. I hope this exploration was as interesting to you as it is to me. I know that's a high bar because I'm very interested in these sorts of things, and they're rather nerdy and rather granular, so for someone else to take an interest in them is a bit of an ask for me, but nonetheless, if you're sticking around, hopefully that means you enjoyed. Make sure to leave a like and a comment on this video. I've been having a little trouble with the YouTube algorithm pushing my content out lately. It seems we're reaching fewer new viewers than usual, and so your support and your likes and comments would really help in this regard. Your support means the world, as always, and until next time, I'll see you on the flip side. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you want to support the creation of bigger and better content on the Samuel Plays Brass channel, have your name featured right here, and a whole host of other perks and benefits, then please consider pledging your support at patreon.com/SamuelPlaysBrass. For now, you can find more videos in the end screen cards to my left.